Today we're going to take a dip into the mainstream, maybe take a sip, see how it tastes. This will be a reoccurring segment on Plus Three because there's quite a bit going on in the mainstream as the psychedelic renaissance progresses. I'm here with Dave Nichols down under.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey there,
Good to
Brian.
be with y'all.
What's going on?
Nishay Devno.
Howdy.
And I'm Brian Pace.
The good news is that we're now moving towards mainstreaming of psychedelics. As we move forward, we'll see that our culture, which has previously had this massive backlash towards psychedelics, that there's a way in which our culture can grow to incorporate these states of mind, and that it won't necessarily remain as hidden and underground.
When I started Goop in 2008, I was like, my calling is something else.
It's the source for high-end lifestyle goods like $950 toilet paper.
The jade egg is an ancient Chinese practice.
Psychedelics have been part of the human history for thousands of years.
Where women insert the jade egg in their lady parts.
Right.
And to help tone the pelvic floor.
How does it help do that?
I don't know. I need to start my jade egg practice.
This is going to be my first experience with mushrooms.
Why do you think it's coming into the mainstream now? How can we really milk the shit out of this?
Gwyneth Paltrow's lifestyle company has agreed to pay a six-figure settlement for false advertising. Goop was accused of making unfounded claims about products designed to aid women's sexual and emotional health. A lawsuit filed by prosecutors from 10 California counties claims that Goop did not have scientific backing for health claims.
People have been selling snake oil for a long time. This is just another type of snake oil.
I had experience with psychedelics, and there are many of them, in an appropriate setting. And the setting is the environment that it was taken in.
Goop.
Hey guys, Tim Ferriss here.
My name is Paul Austin,
Author of The 4-Hour Workweek, The 4-Hour This, That, and the Other Thing.
I'm the founder of a website called The Third Wave.
I did the Tim Ferriss 4-Hour Workweek.
I'm just going to do a check.
You evaluate the income you need by taking all of these various things that you would defer from retirement.
Check, check.
Aston Martin DB9, ski chalet in Colorado for a few weeks of the year. All the things that you would save for retirement. And I think it's important for people to satisfy their financial needs before striving to address all these other needs. Then the trick is to find a business that provides that in the fewest numbers of hours of input as possible. You can turn many different types of products or services into muses, but some things are easier than others.
Microdosing, right?
Attracting an audience, and then you just tell them what you're looking for, and then they give it to you. And you don't even worry about the money. That's what I do. That's what I do. That's what I do.
We choose to go to the moon, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
In many cases, the difficult experiences are when you see the truths you prefer not to see. And you look at the behaviors that may be in your blind spot, and that can be very uncomfortable.
And then they give it to
you. So I just want to share a quote with you by Jim Fadiman, who is on the Tim Ferriss podcast, who's interested in leadership development. We need leaders who are able to access flow states, who can handle
Mysterium tremendum e fascinosum. We get to Greek.
And that's why psychedelics, particularly microdosing, is really seeing a renaissance. And that's actually not that quote, so I messed that up.
But I don't come from a medical background.
Man, I'm fucking this up.
With that, let me introduce our panelists. We have Christian Angermeyer. Let's talk about investment in this space. Your biotech company, Atai Life Sciences, is currently one of the largest investors. How are you thinking about approaching it?
I'm a super coward. I've never smoked a joint. I've never done anything else. I was super worried that my brain cells could die. I met great people like George, who founded Compass, who had the similar thoughts that this should become a medical drug.
We're also really excited about kinds of people who've become involved with us. A former company group chairman of Johnson & Johnson Pharmaceuticals.
The opioid crisis is an imminent danger. My judgment includes findings of fact
and conclusions of law.
The manufacturing and creation of psilocybin, the emergence of the man, quote unquote, in capitals, coming into this environment.
Johnson & Johnson's misleading marketing and promotion of opioids caused an opioid crisis.
Just very different values and mores built into the different communities and perspectives. Really excited about the kinds of people who've become involved with us.
Peter Thiel.
You always want to aim for monopoly.
I urge all of my fellow Americans to stand up and vote for Donald Trump.
MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder is worth looking into. What is it? Methamphetamine. There's that. I might be getting the chemical name wrong. Question for you, Christian. How do you think about creating business models around compounds?
The market is so huge. But there is enough business. The market is growing.
Okay. The market is growing.
My ideal paradigm for psychedelic decriminalization would be, for lack of a better word, the psychedelic spa.
Goop.
I think we live in a world where mental health is becoming a problem because our world where we live in is very bad for our minds, especially for young people if you look at Instagram.
I will give you some advice. I would say, don't obsess on scaling and becoming as big as possible. Scale and scaling are dangerous words. Then, the very next point.
Tim, can I add a point to that? Sometimes I take CBD because, you can't get a matcha without it nowadays.
Thank you. Christian?
Yeah, so one point, the market is huge.
Hi, Mr. Wonderful. Microdosing can be a competitive advantage in the business space. What are your opinions on psychedelics?
Great question. In the early 60s, when LSD hit the scene, people were overdosing on it and hallucinating like crazy. Why not do some research?
The only thing we don't do is get sexual with each other.
In psychology and psychiatry, we're taught don't put your hands on patients. Oh my God, you're going to get in trouble. But I think if we don't learn to do that better, we're going to actually lose some of the opportunity for healing.
What the fuck are you doing to people?
So maybe we can do a Goop MDMA-assisted therapy clinic.
Yeah, it's happening. Next level shit. Sounds like a Christmas party. I know.
Isn't that beautiful?
The psychedelic renaissance is here to help consciousness triumph. Just joking.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the clips we heard, but today we're going to be talking a little bit about the retreat industry, some of the industry moves that have been made and will continue to progress in this brief sort of hot take into mainstreaming. Anybody want to jump in there?
So retreats and patents too, I think, are two things we're going to be touching on today, right?
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think just as a touchstone, when we talk about mainstreaming, it's really important to remember that making psychedelics mainstream means that we're going to be seeing them fitting into sort of all of the advertising frameworks, all of the sort of goofy, cheesy, lowest common denominator pop cultural sort of takes on them, and that a lot of the things that you may see people complaining about, or the things that we may be critiquing, are things that, and this is what the mainstream looks like. This is what we should expect from psychedelic mainstreaming, and this is at least why I've been a vocal opponent to a lot of the mainstreaming moves, because this is the sort of stuff you get. So here we are with Goop and with patents and with all sorts of retreats now being advertised in a variety of media. And again, just to sort of reiterate, whether we're talking about Netflix's coverage of these different retreats, or we're talking about Vice coverage of retreats, all of these articles function as advertisements for these different centers. This is not just disinterested reporting, as much as it may have some of that feel. When these different retreats pop up in different media, this is a chance for them to get their name out there to a psychedelic naive audience, and to people who may be curious about, how can I get these drugs? I'm not necessarily interested or comfortable taking them on my own. And then suddenly you see a name pop up in a media outlet, and it's like, oh, maybe I'll go there. And that comes with a lot of consequences.
Yeah, and especially if it's a reputable media outlet that's mentioning synthesis or whatever else. I think if people see it on that level of kind of sanction, whether or not it's actual sanction, they feel like, oh, if it's featured in a newspaper like that, it must be okay. And just
as featured on Business Insider.
Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly. And just before, because you mentioned that word cheesy, and I just want to emphasize the kind of coverage that the Goop Psychedelic Retreat has gotten online. So there's been in the past few days, The Guardian wrote an article titled "Psychedelic Drugs Have Lost Their Cool, Blame Gwyneth Paltrow and Her Goop." And then Wired actually wrote, "Goop on psychedelics isn't bad, it's just boring." And so, I mean, it's a little shocking, I think, for those of us who are been in the field for a while to see words like boring or, dull like associated with the psychedelic experience. But nonetheless, that's where we are at this point.
Sure. And I mean, Goop even put out on their own website a helpful list of 10 centers for psychedelic healing. So I mean, I think one of the things that we will continue to touch on in discussions of mainstreaming is that as psychedelic industry grows, there will be, and we are seeing already, psychedelic advertising, which is an entire industry designed to emotionally manipulate you, to misrepresent and inflate certain claims, to make certain things cool and other things not cool, to draw those lines. And it's one of the interesting factors when it comes to trying to sell illegal drugs, because despite their subcultural baggage, drugs have always been cool. So the idea is that there's this reverse advertising that says, no, they're not scary. They're not just for edgy people. They are for young professionals like you who have the time and the space and the money, of course, to fly halfway around the world to sit with our experts who will curate your experience, just like
optimize your life.
Yeah,
right.
help you make more money. Yeah,
and this is like the peripheral. Medicalization has been set into motion, and this is like the peripheral medicalization, and in the media of forcing psychedelics into medical framework. I also think it's interesting on the synthesis page. It's my understanding they recently changed their target audience to go out. They're going after professionals now. That's listed on their site now.
One of the things that I think is interesting is that in our first episode we talked about Michael Pollan's Not So Fast on Psychedelic Decriminalization, which ultimately, one way or another, whether it's psychedelic exceptionalism or not, decriminalization of substances is going to be the most democratizing force in terms of access to substances that are generally low cost, and if we're talking about the classical psychedelics, physiologically safe. And there was pushback from Pollan, and we can only assume that there were people advising Pollan that said, hey, this is probably a good idea, a good take to put out there, because the medical model seems to be where everybody's put their chips. And yet, we see some of these same people endorsing completely unregulated international retreats on Netflix. And it's just, I think it's interesting to see who gets the nod and who does not.
Because what's interesting is that all that's happening is that people are trying to make money. Since medicalization is slow to kind of follow its procedures in this country, inevitably what that means is that these retreat centers are popping up places where they're already decriminalized or legal. And so all that you're mentioning, democratizing the access to it, and all that means is that extra barrier is there, so that the people who can afford to travel overseas don't have any of the issues, but then people who can't leave places where it's illegal, they don't have access to those experiences.
Well, and you also wind up with these really sort of screwy positions where you've got somebody, you've got retreat centers that are asking all sorts of medical questions on their intake forms, but unable to, advertise that, oh, we're doing some sort of medical therapy or we're doing whatever. And so in addition to that, right, you get all these disclaimers that we're not engaged in medical, this, that, and the other, that we're just here for the purpose of, facilitating your experience, optimizing this, that, and the other. And then you wind up with these kind of goofy stories. Like there was a Vice article about, like, I went to a high-end psychedelic retreat, right? And there's a moment in there where there's a really difficult experience that the author's having. And
Shayla Love wrote that article.
Yeah. And surprise, like the certified Reiki master that's been brought in to play facilitator isn't equipped to handle what's going on, and is laying hands and doing all sorts of things that,
like saging and things that are like really just adding difficulty to the experience that's already difficult.
Stimulation and such. And I mean, when I read that article, I mean, I definitely saw myself in that, in the sense that, I mean, my psychedelic experiences have never followed any kind of prescribed schedule. And, I'd probably be hanging out in the kitchen too, but it's one of those things where, if we are going towards a for-profit model, particularly with a rather demanding clientele, things are going to have to be regimented, optimized, because it doesn't make the same kind of money if you do this one-on-one kind of care.
Well, and I do want to say a few things about that article, because I feel like,
do.
I mean, just to emphasize, it came out the exact same week that Goop launched on Netflix. So they're not talking about each other in any way, but they're both, kind of the moment in terms of their engagement with these retreat centers. And the author, she says in it that she was not explicitly going to deal with some kind of deep trauma or, but that people, and this is something that I think it was Matt Johnson in the article of Hopkins mentioned, that like everyone has stuff they're dealing with, and you don't always know how that stuff is going to come up. And so, she asked these questions afterwards. It was like, don't you think that maybe the way that these retreat centers are functioning, it's sort of inevitable that people who are really feeling like they need help are going to end up going there, and that you guys don't have the infrastructure to support people going through difficult experiences? And in her case specifically, like she was an excellent example of that, where, she didn't come away traumatized by the experience, but it was really hard in a way that I felt didn't need to be the case, in the sense that, like, had she have been somewhere where she knew, she had friends, she felt safe, she understood what was going on, she was somewhere familiar, a lot of the issues I don't think would have expressed themselves in the same way. And that's something that Catherine McLean said in a Facebook post responding to it, where she advocates for more community-based, community-integrated approaches to psychedelic use, where you're not spending money and using planes to travel to the other side of the world and feeling pressured to go through with something you've invested a lot of money in, but that you're near your home, feeling safe, etc. So I feel like that's a really important point to bring up, that those models are not, the retreat model is not able to deal with the inevitable difficulties that people are going to have.
There's also something to be said for outsourcing. Sorry, just real quick, just like outsourcing that expectation of care, right? Like in a DIY context, like you have to have the understandings and you have to cultivate that and develop that and work with doses that will help you, facilitate your own experiences or be present for others, right? Like the sort of networks and support that become necessary through that sort of self-reliance, I think, are really important. And I think that gets sort of swept aside in people's rush to have some sort of quick fix or curative experience or breakthrough or what have you, where it's like, the notion that this stuff should be crammed into incredibly busy lives, and that I just don't have the time to learn about it. I just don't have the time to like sit and do the research. I would contend then you probably don't really have time for the experience. Obviously, that's just my position. But
and even like the information that was given across, like to that Vice journalist, like she was under the impression that there would be like a female like facilitator on hand at all times, and then when she needed help, that person wasn't there. And then she found out, oh, it's normal for them to take like a 25-30 minute lunch break or whatever. But that wasn't effectively communicated to her. And so and that's partially, I think, because there's just a quick rundown of what's going to happen, and you're not really super prepared for where you are, or the time change perhaps even messing with you, and really fully understanding what your availability is in terms of the support that is there.
Yeah, so I wanted to touch briefly on this this little parable that we had discussed previously, but only briefly, which was that from the Aron Fund, We Will Call It Paula. And in We Will Call It Paula, it sort of games out some of the competitive environment that we can expect to see in the psychedelic space, in the retreat space in particular. So in it, there's this character that is introduced, and her name is Leary, and she is a very idealistic young marketer who herself has had an incredible experience. And I'm just going to read like 2 or 3 short segments of it just to highlight how interesting it is. It says, Leary was not a therapist. She was a marketer, a storyteller, but she was passionate and charismatic. She painted a vision. People bought in. Leary found a team of therapists with years of experience as psychedelic guides. Her plan was simple: to build clinics for psychedelic treatment, for intake and preparation, through psychedelic experiences themselves to the work of integration. And then it sort of progresses into this like capitalistic nightmare where it says, Leary argued that large-scale solutions for psychedelic treatment were inevitable. Psychedelic treatment was providing breakthrough outcomes in mental health. Corporations were already forming. Venture capitalism was arriving, and the gears of commerce were beginning to creak to life. All of this begged the question, if not Leary, who? This was going to happen. This was happening. And then finally, just skipping a little ahead, says, the more she learned about her what her competitors were doing, the more skeptical Leary became. Eleusinian, in particular, seemed to be ruthless in their appetite for growth. They already had the most competitive rates, even after Gaia's changes, and Leary couldn't imagine how they had cut their prices so much yet again.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's just one of those things where I think a point that we have orbited around here on this podcast is the idea that it's unlikely that psychedelics are going to themselves change psychedelics so much as society, so much as society will likely change our experience of psychedelics.
Well, and the notion that looking at the history of capitalism and the things that it has crushed and recuperated and folded into itself quite successfully, the notion that somehow psychedelics, especially apolitical, ahistorical, acritical psychedelics, are going to pose a substantial challenge to that, right? Like, as Normie pointed out the other day, capitalism is destroying the world. So here, we'll invite capitalism in as like the, distribution methods for psychedelics somehow to see positive change.
Well, I think this begs the question, are psychedelics actually medicine?
I feel like a lot of people have this uncritical faith that it's going to be this Trojan horse situation where it's like, haha, capitalism is accepting us into, and then inevitably, we can climb out of the horse and open the gates and it'll all be over, and people just kind of, that myth is just enough for people that they feel like that will just happen, and they don't really think very deeply about the potential alternatives to that scenario.
Well, right. And where's the evidence for it? Like if we look at what's going on with the pharmaceutical psychedelic players, I mean, there was just an article in Fortune that I'm really appreciative about the amount of stuff that was covered there and that is now on the public record. But you have Carrie Turnbull, who emphasizes he's speaking for himself, but who is affiliated with USONA and Hefter, going through what George Goldsmith and Compass have attempted to patent, and showing that they attempted to patent some of the Hoffman methods for psilocybin. And it's like, I'm sorry, no, this is exactly what Bob Jesse was talking about way back at CIIS, where he pulled out a stack of books, was like, these figures have historically put their work into the public, into the commons, have published and shared their information. And now you've got companies coming along trying to add a thin veneer of proprietary something or other, or in some cases just saying straight up, no, this is ours. We've discovered this. We've presented a new creative take on this. And with the number of cases presented in that article where Compass appears to have been trying to patent things that were already on the record, and now with their claim that, you know, they've got this Comp 360 compound that's a psilocybin-like or psilocybin-derived medicine. It's like it's psilocybin with fillers, right? And you've pursued all of the capitalist methods to shore up your shareholder impressions, right? You've created a context where you can secure investment because you say to your shareholders or potential investors, hey, we have proprietary control over this supply. We're set up to block other people from entering the terrain. And I don't know how you can do that on the one hand, and on the other hand, say we're doing this for the good of humanity. Like, if you want a case of that, what that looks like, look at the polio vaccine.
I mean, it's woke capitalism 101 right here. I mean, there's this idea that, you know, anything in the market is good. And it's something that's existed, you know, since for a while, but it's very much been center stage in culture since the Reagan era, that, you know, greed is good. And I mean, you know, we're seeing actors move into the space, like specifically doing the, you know, IP game, where, you know, some Miami researchers recently just moved into sustainably produced psilocybin, and they're doing it by chucking it into E. coli. Now, that's interesting. It is interesting. But is it really more sustainable than producing psilocybin from literal cow dung? Like, I beg to differ. I've been in a science lab. There's quite a bit of plastic that's produced when one is, you know, culturing agar for your E. coli and what have you. So it's transparent that several actors are building up structures that ultimately served no purpose other than to support their IP and try and build a walled garden around whatever segment of the market they can capture. I mean, Peter Thiel in particular has stated that competition is terrible. He doesn't like it. You know,
well,
so
you should try to have a monopoly if
right,
you want to maximize
exactly.
your you know, profits, outcomes, whatever. And, you know, you also have people on the other hand, like Rick, saying, oh, no, these people aren't interested in monopoly. And so seeing the way that these narratives get twisted to say, hey, no, mainstreaming is good. Don't listen to the things that the people involved in mainstreaming are saying. We're telling you they're good, and we've been championing the psychedelic cause. I mean, the cognitive dissonance here is kind of phenomenal. I mean, and that's cropped up on the Goop episode. That's cropped up on coverage of the Goop discussion of psychedelics, where you had New York Times sort of arguing these sort of anti-science absurdities about the merits of woo. And you know, it all seems pretty absurd to me.
Well, what really upset me about that article was that, like, it is true that cultural bias has delayed science around and understanding around psychedelics in our culture. And so, like, to take that truth and then apply it to all of the non-evidence based stuff that Goop supports. I mean, I was shocked that in Netflix, Gwyneth Paltrow was saying how much she loves the vagina, and then she's talking to, like, an expert who explained that the visual outside part of the body is not the vagina, and she had no idea after, like, saying, oh, this is my favorite thing, you know. And so it's like that kind of like anti-intellectual embrace of psychedelics I find pretty disturbing.
Totally. Well, and in the New York Times piece, you know, the defense around the jade eggs, right? They were claiming that oh, you know, everybody was outraged about the jade eggs, but, like, why was nobody upset about the documented harms of gynecological devices like Escher and pelvic mesh? And when I read that, I was like, well, hold on. First of all, this is whataboutism. You know, this is a two-bouquet fallacy. But then beyond that, it's like, if you Google Escher or pelvic mesh, the first thing you see is discussions about their harms, their lack of safety. If you go to the Wikipedia, again, it's right there. It's clear. And so the sort of juggling and I think bit of intellectual dishonesty that went on in that article to sort of say, oh, there's a whole bunch of things we don't know. It's like, yes, you're absolutely correct. Science is not good for measuring everything. At the same time,
just so
like,
we're clear, which article is it? Is it the How Goop's Haters Made Gwyneth Paltrow's company worth? Okay, it's
no.
one.
This was
It was
Who's
more
Afraid of-
recently. I forget the two authors' names, but they were talking about. I
Is
forget
it
the title.
who's afraid of Gwyneth Paltrow and Goop?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that was clear if anybody wants to go read it.
Because I wrote an article touching on a short, statement, like touching on that article for the journal Synopsis. And as I was researching it, it turned out that article, like those two authors had written a version of for Scientific American, I believe it was, and that it was completely riddled with errors to the point that Scientific American had to retract it. And they just kind of like re-finessed a few things, and New York Times didn't bat an eyelash, didn't realize that this had been like formally retracted by a different outlet.
Yeah, and it doesn't make I don't find that surprising given the kind of arguments that were there. But also, again, like these sorts of gymnastics fit into this mainstreaming model. This sort of, come up with the narrative that sounds good. Does it matter if it's true? No, it's got truthiness, right? It feels good enough to some people that like it has enough legs to sort of, especially in an anti-science climate, propagate itself, spread these ideas, say, oh, science shouldn't have a corner on the truth. And so here are a whole bunch of assertions that we're going to put out there because this makes us feel comfortable. This pushes product. This, allows us to perpetuate whatever ideas we have.
Yeah, and this gains us visibility. It's the game.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the audience game. I think that, as we're talking about trying to dismantle, prohibition in some kind of stepwise way, we talked about this standard story that, medicalization will ultimately lead to, the legalization of psychedelics. And, that's something that Rick Doblin and MAPS have discussed for a long time, although it seems a bit less so these days as they're actually dealing with the FDA right now. But I mean, it's one of those things where a full decriminalization scenario, I think, is going to be a lot better for just access if we're talking about this, because, in terms of who has healthcare, in terms of, who has mental health care, we're going into ever like narrowing windows. I mean, when I had healthcare, for instance, I wanted to do like a sleep study because I keep my wife up with snoring. I couldn't even find the time to break away to schedule this, 24-hour commitment or 12-hour commitment to get something that, has caused something that bothers me in my life. And in terms of like whether or not like psychedelics are compatible with capitalism, I think one of the main things that they have going against them is the amount of time, the sheer duration of something like LSD or mushrooms with all of the preparation and, decompression, integration, what have you. It argues that only the rich are really going to be able to break away and do this.
And with the spa model, I mean, this is like, that is Goop's whole thing, is that like part of being super wealthy is the privilege to be among the only healthy, non-toxic people on the planet. And they're okay with that. Like that's okay.
And also, I mean, the other thing you'll see is, aside from the spa model, is probably people pushing very potent psychedelics like 5-MeO-DMT, saying, hey, look, this happens real short. This is a real short duration, so we can actually fit this in. This is much better aligned. Never mind the fact that we're talking an incredibly powerful experience. I mean, and the other thing discussing spas, if you look back at the history of Compass or Eleusis, and those were some of the first models they were looking at doing. It was psychedelic hospice and spas on the side, which is why, when they give their narratives about what brought them into this today, those narratives don't quite align with their initial stated interest. But as we're talking about some of the medical narratives around this, Normie, you were discussing some important points the other day dealing with the number of people who have actually gone through studies that show some of these medical applications, the fact that the way a lot of this is being spoken of, it's very authoritative, or it's like there's really good documentation around this, but you were saying, I mean, we've had this discussion for a while.
Yeah, we're working on a series with our writer Russell Hosfeld, and yeah, basically we're looking at the the total amount of investments, and just the growing of the corporate psychedelics, and all of that it's resting on the data as far as people who have actually taken psilocybin for major depression is in like the very low double digits at this point. There's sort of two groups. There's an Imperial study that has basically given people with major depression psilocybin, very, very, very few people. And also there is the other data there is people who have been given psilocybin for cancer anxiety, which some researchers have said this is a completely different species of depression. You can't really use that.
Like universalized from that.
Yes, and to be clear, there's tons of anecdotal data that's out there. So, but I just think it's really fascinating how basically two studies can bring in tens and tens of millions of dollars. And so I would argue that if Michael Pollan wants to say, hey, let's not move so fast, I would argue let's not move so fast there. Building these giant industries off of 1 to 2 psilocybin for depression studies.
Preach, man, preach.
And also it got me thinking, Sam Canone's in the book Dreamland, on the origins of the opioid crisis. In 1980, there was it's referred to as Porter and Jick, and that was a single paragraph that was submitted to a letter to the editor, and that was a doctor, and basically one of his assistants, if I recall, one of his assistants basically looked at the patients that he had given opioids to and said that there was no signs that this was addictive. And Purdue ran with that one paragraph, and that was just replicated in a big game of telephone throughout the scientific and academic communities. And so I think that caution here, if we want to say, hey, let's slow down a little bit, I think the slowing down a little bit is in just this extreme corporate growth, where it gets to the point that you have investors like Mike Novogratz just saying that, hey, this is going to be a short-term bubble. We're actually saying that based on 1 to 2 very, very small studies. I think I would just urge caution there before we go out and we just throw this out onto Netflix where millions of people are going to see it, and let's just calm down a little bit.
Yeah, I would say that, one of the things that we are continually trying to pick apart here on +3 is like the disconnect between what is known and unknown, and the rhetoric that is becoming increasingly loud and turning into a particular kind of chorus singing a corporate song. I mean, the advertising in particular that is inevitable, we haven't seen anything yet.
And I want to be clear about
concerning.
another thing here. The reason that the FDA had, my understanding, the reason that the FDA was the one that actually recommended to the research organizations that they should go back and they should do psilocybin for major depression. It was the FDA that suggested that,
Totally.
Because initially cancer anxiety, when they brought cancer anxiety to the FDA said that this isn't even a diagnosis. We don't even recognize this. So how about you do it for major depression? So, that's how that originated.
Well, and as we talk, yeah, go ahead, Pace.
Just a real quick pop culture reference. If any of y'all seen Soylent Green, in Soylent Green, the end of life psychedelic trip is featured as a tiny little subplot in there. I just think there's something odd about that.
But also, as Normie points out, around these games of telephone and messaging and the way that regulatory bodies shape that, and Nishay's earlier points about like science and the fact that like, you know, there are all of these competing interests that are taking place that exist in these arenas, paying attention to the chorus, paying attention to the message, looking at, say, Porter and Jick, right? Like that little bit, it got so telephoned out that you had people referring to it as the Porter and Jick paper. And it wasn't a paper. And there are really interesting comparisons to be made between opiates and psychedelics, as absurd as that may sound, where there was, the Lexington Farm in Kentucky, which was used as, it was a prison, right? And the prison population, in addition to being tested, I believe, not to their knowledge, but some of the prisoners being used in MK Ultra experiments, they were also developing multidisciplinary approaches to opiate therapies at the farm. And one of the things that took place there was that the realization that as they gamed all of this out and developed these really interesting and potentially effective multidisciplinary opiate therapies, was that insurers ultimately balked at engaging with the multidisciplinary stuff. You know, it was the kind of thing where as it rolled out from beyond the lab into the wild, insurers started stripping out all of the multidisciplinary stuff to the point where it was just pills. Right?
This is actually something we see in the ibogaine community a lot. I mean, the ibogaine community has been dealing with, you know, extremely adverse circumstances to treat an extremely vulnerable patient population. These are opiate addicts this is their last resort treatment. And as far as I can tell, the debate in terms of best practices of ibogaine treatment is like, ideally you've got a month, you know, maybe even 3. And part of that is rebuilding one's relationship with food, nutrition, exercise, and community. It's absolutely this multidisciplinary approach. It's what seems to work. And it's actually something that in a clinical model is what starts to approach what, you know, community and traditional practices have always been. I mean, peyote has been used on Indian reservations to deal with alcoholism in those communities for a long time.
But this is what mainstreaming looks like, right?
Sure.
Like the notion that insurers and payers won't cover the costs of multidisciplinary therapy. So what can we actually get funding for? What can actually get traction? What can actually go forward?
This is why moving forward, integration, you know, preparation is probably going to be outsourced to an app. There's not enough human beings in the world to handle.
Certainly not in a cost-effective way where you can scale.
Would be astronomical, and so you're going to see this. You're going to see these integrations. You know, these corporate partnerships with apps like Calm right now, where they basically, and we're covering this in our series that we're releasing soon, where apps like Calm basically they outsource therapy to you. You're a therapist. You have to sign up. You have to sign up.
That's
to
7
become a
Cups.
listener. 7 Cups.
Yeah.
There's going to be a whole host of these. This is going to explode. You know, where all of this is outsourced to a variety of apps, and then if you want to sign up to be a listener, you're going to be immediately put in contact with someone who might have depression, and you are just a person listening to them. And at the same time, those apps are going to be designed to collect a whole host of data, you know, to further monetize and develop new revenue streams. So that's a whole issue that's going to become bigger as we move along. Privacy, you know, mental health, data privacy, and all that. That's also part of the mainstreaming process. And you know, if you control the data, you know, you control all the power. If that's not clear yet.
It doesn't have to be that way, though. I mean, I just like want to emphasize that because it sort of sounds inevitable the way you're describing it. But I feel like, you know, Bernie
doesn't
right
have
now
to.
is a front runner. And if there were meaningful reforms in terms of like the data sharing and, you know, different approach to what
privacy
the economy looks like, you know, so it's like right now there is this kind of sinister future scenario, but, you know, we can change things before it gets bad.
Yes, we can change things. There needs to be fundamental reform in people's people owning their own data, you know.
Well, that's just it at this point, right? I've heard people suggest that data is more valuable than oil. We had Cambridge Analytica. We have targeted the amount of stuff that you can do with data at this point, you know, that the intersection of psychedelics and healthcare interfaces is perhaps one of the most valuable areas in this whole emerging industry. And that's, you know, companies that are attracted to that. It's not a mistake that some of the holding companies behind these different psychedelic startups also have medical monitoring software, also are involved in whatever sort of tech startups and AI and this, that, and the other, right? There's from an investor construct from you know, how are you going to be able to entice investors? How are you going to be able to bring people on board? How are you going to be able to pitch profitability, especially when you're looking at therapies that are still in many cases illegal? The exciting thing is, look at how much data there could be here. Look, even before we start rolling this out, if we get people engaged with these different apps, with MindStrong, with Calm, with all of these different things, there's a treasure trove of personal information that could be available
Certainly
to sell.
great investor pitches.
Well, when you've got a vulnerable population out there that's looking for relief from intractable mental health problems, many of which are extremely excruciating, debilitating, if left untreated, lead to suicide and such. If you have somebody say, well, sign on the dotted line for all of the things that you know, we're not liable for and all of the data that we can collect, you're not going to have too many people to say no on that basis.
It's not even sign on the dotted line. It's press this button if you want to continue using this app. For example, in the Uber privacy policy, I believe that if that Uber driver smashes into another car and breaks your neck, like, you can't sue Uber.
It's called click wrap.
Yeah, a story on that, you know, just came out. People don't read privacy policies or terms of service. That's not.
They're designed not to be read. They're designed to overwhelm. They call it click wrap because the whole point is that, like, it's there to, you know, you just click through it. This is what's needed to use the service. And ultimately, if you need to use the service, you need to use the service.
Yeah. So I mean, as we see mainstreaming progress, we're going to see the lowest common denominator discussions continue. And, you know, there's going to be a lot of stripping out of, you know, the previous subcultural baggage and, you know,
in certain areas.
In certain areas, yeah. I mean,
Because
in others,
there's also,
that same baggage will be used to market these retreats and these services.
Sure,
regardless.
I'm going to argue that, like, the local decriminalization measures that are happening in Denver. There's one that's starting up in Boulder. There's the DC one. There's the Santa Cruz one. These are going to proliferate. This is also mainstreaming. This is a part of the mainstreaming process, and these are going to evolve rapidly. There's different schools of thought that exist within different decriminalization proponents. You know, so I think, you know, to be fair, part of mainstreaming is the decriminalization process as well. And I think that goes a long way too. That goes a long way in changing people's minds too. You know, when, oh, Boulder did this, oh, this is happening all over the place.
Sure. And I mean, I would argue that there are parts of, you know, a reintegration of psychedelics into, you know, society that I'm actually very for. I mean, the idea that people can have access to medicine and experiences that are profoundly valuable and healing. Of course, I'm for that. But note that what we're talking about here is access. And the current models, because they are current models. The retreat system is the de facto psychedelic medicine, psychedelic industry that is available today, and it's chugging along quite well. If it continues the way it does, there's no reason to believe that some version of that, some model that we're currently seeing out in the wild in Costa Rica and the Netherlands becomes the standard in the United States and the European Union. And I still have questions about access because it's just, just like if 100% of the workers of the world had access, were members of a functioning union, capitalism would collapse. If everyone who needed psychedelics got it, I'm not sure that it would be manageable in the models that we're seeing right now.
Well, and I think that goes to questions of how this gets leveraged, right? Like one of the things that's coming up is not that I don't think any of us are opposed to psychedelics for social change or for, addressing or critiquing or providing lenses or catalysts for challenging the world that we find ourselves in. At the same time, this notion that, if we just put it into the mainstream, if we just put it in the water supply or the therapy supply or the whatever supply, this is somehow going to lead to a net good. And that seems to be the assumption that is going along with a lot of this. So I think, go ahead.
Well, I think, it's important to stress too, that some people just genuinely naively believe that or have faith in that. And other people are like corporate actors who are willing to, instrumentalize that naive belief in service of their own kind of profiting ends.
Yeah,
of course.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that as we're going to wait and see. Ultimately, this is a multivariate, multi-pronged situation where there are a lot of different actors, a lot of different competing models. There are people who are organizing to decriminalize psychedelics in as many as 100 cities today, and they may win. And there are other folks that are attempting to patent very particular processes for manufacturing psilocybin. They may win too. It's a matter of which stakeholder actually takes the field.
It's a matter of which stakeholders actually are funded, and the decriminalization movements are underfunded.
Yeah, I feel like, a lot of grassroots movements are underfunded. And I think part of what we're trying to do, and why I wanted to mention earlier that things don't have to go in this dark direction, is that, people who want a different model and that's not in service of capitalism, that is in service of justice and equity and access. Part of the goal of this podcast is to kind of gather those forces together such that we can actually have conversations about alternatives without being gaslit by these, naive mythologies.
That's a great place to wrap, I think.
Here.
Yep. Preach.
Thanks for listening, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll be talking more about mainstreaming as things develop. So this will
things
be an
are happening
segment
on a daily basis at this point. There's a lot going on.
Cool. Thanks, y'all. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
So long.
Peace.